Right, well, morning everybody, and thank you for signing up and joining the first live presentation of the 2021 Festival of Road Safety. I can always feel the excitement through my laptop. We're delighted to be joined by Richard Owen, who is the CEO of Agilysis, for a presentation titled Post-Pandemic Road Safety, How Can We Understand What's Changed on Our Roads? Richard anticipates he's going to talk for between 20 and 30 minutes. And then we will have time for questions at the end. There are two ways which you can actually ask questions or pose questions. Number one, throughout the presentation, if you like, you can use the chat function at the bottom of the screen or bottom of the window, and we'll feed these in as and when we get the opportunity to. Or secondly, you can use the raised hand function if you are brave enough. Again, that can be found at the bottom. And if you do choose to use that method, I will let you know that it's your turn to ask the question, and we'll give you the permissions to talk, and we can have a nice discussion. Anyway, that's enough from me. I think that's all I've got to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everybody. Okay, it's no pressure being the first live presentation this year's event. It is a shame that we're not doing it in person with a packed room full of 200 odd people. I really do miss the conferences I've been to, a lot over the years. So it is a shame not to be able to see everybody in person. So I can see there's a number of you on the call that I've met and worked with in the past. And I think as much as this is me talking about some of the evidence that we've got about this, it's about your opportunity to interact, share your experiences, and then provide feedback to me, and then we can discuss that within the group. So we'll see how this goes. As Ed said, you can chat amongst yourselves in there. You can also post specific questions, and then I'll try and answer as many of those at the end. We don't have any specific polls on this, but if you could just keep two things in the back of your mind. One of them is the big question for us, which is, do we think that the road safety situation has changed on our roads? Have our roads got safer? Or have they got less safe? I'm going to talk about how we define safety, but think about your roads, and your particular thoughts about whether this whole pandemic experience has led to any kind of benefits whatsoever in terms of road safety. And then the other question is, has this entire experience, everything that's happened over the last 18 months or so, had an impact on your roles as well? Are we moving towards a much more integrated transport management kind of service? Are we actually delivering more on sustainable transport and public health? Has the pandemic actually been the push that's made us work together and think about how we promote active travel, for example? Okay, so I've got about 20 minutes or so worth of slides on here. Some of the slides some of you may have seen before, and those of you that have spent a bit of time on the DFT website or looked at our website and some of our reports will be familiar with some of the content. I have made sure that I've included links to all of the evidence should you want to go and have a look at it and do your own research, as they say. I'm pulling out here what I think are the most important changes that we've seen on our roads over the last 18 months. So actually, at the last year's event, I did do a presentation trying to understand some of the immediate changes that we saw on our roads in that initial lockdown. So what I'm going to try and do here is explore what I think's happened more in the longer term. And I'm going to be covering three different categories within this. So I'm going to talk about changing road use, which I think is really important that we understand how the public have changed how we use the roads has influenced intrinsic levels of safety. Talk a little bit about behaviour. And I'm going to be picking just on one behaviour there, which is mainly related to speed, but I've heard anecdotal evidence of other changes in road user behaviour as well. And then look at the current evidence on road casualty data that we have there, albeit it's only for 2020. We don't have anything, certainly at a national level, from the last few months. So thinking about changing road use, we've got that picture on the left-hand side that, perhaps is the image that many people will recognise from that first lockdown. So this is a very quiet urban area. It's somebody cycling down the middle of the road. They've got their mask on, and there's not cars, there's not traffic there. These very quiet streets, and people choosing to use active modes of transport. Was that really the picture that we saw then, and is that the picture that we saw now, or are we more that picture on the right hand side, the scene that I'm sure none of us really enjoyed, but those busy streets dominated by commuters in their cars effectively? What are we looking at? So there is some evidence that's out there that we can look at. So the Department for Transport and the government, through their weekly briefings, you may have remembered this, they started publishing information on how people were moving around the country. So what you can do is you can go on to the DfT website, and you can actually download daily information that tells you, based on a sample size across the whole of the country, how people have been using different forms of transport. So if you look at the left of that chart there, we've got the axis. So wherever you've got the value of 1, that represents the baseline value. And the way that DfT presented this was, it was a baseline against an individual week in the pre-pandemic period. So all those other forms of transport are benchmarked against that. So if you see any of those spiky lines that go above that value of 1, then that means that you're seeing more transport by that form of mode. And then obviously if it's lower, then that's below. So if you see the figure of 0.5, that means you're getting half as much traffic using that mode. And if it's 2, then it's double. So yeah, you can see in those early lockdown months, very quickly, a huge drop in the amount of traffic, certainly within April there. So if you look at the bottom there, we've got the 2 public transport modes. So those are buses and trains. There are actually separate data sets available for London, which I haven't included in this one because I felt that the chart was busy enough as it was. So you can see, had those big drop-offs in bus and train patronage, and they came back a little bit last year in the unlockdown periods that we had. But then dropped again in the 3rd lockdown, I think we were calling it, the one at the beginning of January. And, in this data, you can see towards the end of September, beginning of October, those levels were starting to pick back up, but still not at the same kind of levels that existed before. Within motorized vehicle, you can see that we've got cars, vans, and large goods vehicles, not light goods vehicles, but large goods vehicles. Within the trends. So yeah, the cars are the kind of brown line there, and yeah, you can see the same kind of dips and trends, not as significant within those public transport modes, but almost getting back to the kind of pre-pandemic levels, just a little bit reduced there. But for large goods vehicles and vans, it looks like they're actually a little bit higher than they were in the pre-pandemic period. Now, obviously, the big spikes that you can see on here is in the cycling data, and yeah, if you go away and have a look at this, you can see how the DfT collected that data. They actually used some mobile phone data from, I think it was O2, that supplied information on when it thought people were traveling between different cell towers, and then it estimated whether somebody was either cycling or walking. And what they did is they used that to estimate the level of cycling that went on there. So it wasn't using any of your traditional cycle counters. They came up with a very novel method of doing that, which is possibly why it's quite spiky. But yeah, you can see that there was that big boom in cycling in the original lockdown period, but now it's more or less at the same levels that we saw before. And actually, the next slide that I'm just going to show here just summarizes that information. So this is looking at the most recent data in there, which was towards the end of September. How do the levels in that individual month? And I was only looking at weekdays within this. I didn't include the weekend information. Where does that stand? So yeah, you do actually have a slight increase in the level of cycling, but yeah, cars more or less back to normal, and they do make up the majority there. So yeah, you can kind of see what's happened within those transport modes. And what I was particularly interested in is the relationship between car traffic and cycling traffic. So there was a lot of talk about the big boom in cycling. Nobody could buy a bike, even if they wanted to. And then the government were keen to make sure that we were getting our existing old bikes repaired. So they put out those vouchers to make sure that you can spend 50 quid on getting your chain oiled and all those kinds of things. So yeah, there has been a big focus on cycling, although I do recognise that there are other forms of active travel, with walking being the most popular one, that's for sure. But yeah, so had a look at cycling and had a look at how there was the relationship between cycling and car use throughout this kind of COVID period. So what you can see there is we've got some indexes, so using those same kinds of baselines there. So wherever you see 1, so we've got that little cross in the center there, that represents normality according to that individual baseline period. So let's have a look at what happened in lockdown 1. So you can see there, car traffic suppressed, so it moved down the chart there, and by and large, cycling traffic was significantly increased. Quite a spread in the cycling data there, but the car traffic data, it was slightly more condensed. So we got quite a lot of confidence in there that there was a good reduction in car traffic. And at the same time, and correlation, it's not always causation, there was an increase in cycling. Then we come to lockdown 2. So lockdown 2, for those of you that remember, was November. Now, I have used the English lockdown periods, and I know that there were different lockdown periods and different rules in different parts of the country. And then we had regional lockdowns, a traffic light system. You can't possibly put all of that against all of the individual daily dots on this. So I've just tried to look at those individual lockdowns that applied to most of the country for most of the time. So you can see within that November 1, yes, there was the reduction in car traffic, but it certainly wasn't as significant as we saw in lockdown 1. And actually, no significant increase in cycling at all. Now, it was November, and those of you that remember the weather last April, and May, it was significantly warmer and drier. And maybe that, along with the novelty factor, was the thing that was pushing people to do more cycling. Possibly there were more people put on furlough as well at the same time. Have a look at lockdown 3. So this aligns with, the kind of January through to March period earlier this year. So all of those dots represent a day when the schools were shut. You can see a very similar trend, slightly a bigger reduction in the amount of car traffic, but no great change in the cycling or walking. Then I can throw all of the other days where there wasn't an official lockdown on there, and you can see that, we do have that slight decrease in car traffic even in those non-lockdown periods. But the fluctuation in cycling traffic is it is there to see. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. So there is something that's going on, but as we were seeing in the most recent September data, it's not a massive change. We're not seeing double the level of cycling, at least according to the data within here. So this has made me think a little bit about those patterns that we saw in lockdown 1 and how relevant are they? Yes, we saw dramatically lower traffic, but people had more of this free time. We had better weather. There was perhaps that novelty factor that meant that more of us were willing to go out and cycle. But were we cycling for work? I've showed the weekday data to try and represent that, because that, I think, is where we want to see the significant changes. I would argue that it's less interesting to see an increase in leisure cycling, for example, as it is to see people who are truly undertaking modal shift. So yeah, was lockdown 1 just representative of less total movement and not actually that modal shift? It's a good question. So has road use changed significantly, or are we all back to pre-pandemic levels? It seems like we're back to pre-pandemic a little bit, but then there have been some changes in individual transport modes. But in order to find out what's happening at a local level, which I'm sure many of you here are representing local authorities, individual areas, rather than England or a nation as a whole, we need some more data. And the great news is that actually we've discovered many more data sources over this period. So one of those is information coming from alternative types of traffic count device. Some of you may be aware of Vivacity, and I know other companies that do this are available, where instead of using, the traditional tubes in the road or loops, they're using video data and artificial intelligence to detect VRUs, people using active travel modes. So this is just a sample count and the kind of outputs that you get there. So it will show you the total number of motor vehicles that it detects. So it's got effectively a CCTV camera that points at a street scene. And then you can all see the pedestrian counts and cyclist counts at the same time over time. Now, that's really good if you want to have a look at what's happening when you've decided to put those cameras in place, and you would need to leave them in there for a long time to monitor that kind of trend. But if you hadn't had the foresight to put those in the pre-pandemic period, then you don't really have much of a baseline to go on. But there are other data sources that are available too. And some of those come from telematics sources, and we've been using them within some of our tools over the last year or so. So this is a quick, hopefully, video guide of the here we go. So this is Cardiff. So this is zooming in, and what this is showing is average traffic levels on individual city streets. So this comes from telematics data, so from vehicle sat navs, etc. And because you can gather together lots of information from lots of different sources, you can work out how many vehicles are using individual roads. And also, as you can see on here, you can gather information about speeds on those locations. So, having access to this kind of data is something that we're finding that lots of people are using at the moment to try and understand what was happening on the road. So you can get this information available for the pre-COVID period as well as the post-COVID period. And the really interesting thing there is to try and compare what was happening before and after. Have we seen changes in road use on individual streets or citywide in this example? So yeah, there are more data sets that are available if people want to explore those, and you can buy the data yourself, or you can get various companies that provide tools and solutions to enable you to analyze it yourself. So we talked about some of the changes that have happened. So, top right hand corner, we've got the delivery driver. If many of us didn't have an Amazon Prime subscription before the pandemic, I think there's a lot more that certainly did now. We've got a lot more used to having home deliveries. I mean, there was the lockdown, so we were advised not to go out. But, has this seen a change in, the numbers of those vehicles on the roads, and are they posing more of a risk? So we've definitely seen there's been the increase there, but do we know enough about the risk? And I think the same goes for, the e-scooters as well. So I know that this is something that a lot of us have been looking at. PAX have just published a report this week that looks at the safety of rental scheme scooters versus private scooters, an area where we're only just getting some information. How can we tell more about where people are using e-scooters on the roads? And the answer is that we don't really know outside of hire schemes. It'd be good if you had, that kind of AI video data that could capture and tell you whether somebody was using an e-scooter. I think that'd be really useful. But do we really know how much of a mix they're playing? We saw that, pedestrians are much more common than cyclists. I mean, our e-scooter users much, much lower. So therefore, are we seeing a significant change, and are they just people who used to walk or used to cycle, which isn't really the objective here? We want to get people out of cars, don't we, if we want to meet all our various different objectives around safety, sustainability, and public health, of course. So thinking about the changing road use, can we reliably measure change at the national level? Well, I think we've shown that there's some data sets that are available there that has shown us what has been happening at a national level. But does the local data and evidence provide a better indication of perhaps where you've had success? So can you benchmark yourself and your changes within your data against the national picture? Do you have that evidence available to say that perhaps you've seen a 50% increase in van use or something like that? Because that would give you a real big clue towards an emerging problem. Have you got that evidence and information available to you? And then also, we've got this information about traffic. You would hope that less traffic on the roads would mean safer roads. It seems reasonably logical, wouldn't it? Fewer journeys, fewer people being injured on the roads. But do we know that that's actually happened? It's a complicated picture. We're going to talk a little about it in a moment, but we're just going to address one of the big questions here, which is around behaviour. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about speeding here. And we did some analysis in conjunction with 5 local authorities in the very early lockdown period, April through to May, where we got information from 100 different speed survey sensors that were in operation pre and post pandemic. And then we tried to have a look at what was happening on the roads. I'm sure many of you will remember or even witnessed, some of the extreme speeds that were recorded. Some great tweets and evidence that were being put out there at the time by roads policing units talking about the incredibly high speeds of detections that were being seen. But, was that reflective of everybody at the same time? So, we thought, let's have a look at this information. And what you can hopefully see on these charts is, so that dotted line there is the lockdown period. Before then, by the individual speed limit, we've got average percentage over the speed limit, and many of you already know this. So at the bottom there, you've got 60 mile per hour national speed limit roads. Compliance on those generally in the UK is really good, but compliance gets worse and worse. I think if we had some 20 limits in here, you'd see compliance, even worse, right off the top of that scale. But yeah, you can see that we track that by individual speed limits, and in the post-pandemic period there was a definite increase in the percentage of people exceeding the speed limit, and that was even more the case when you looked at some of the high-end speeders and also some of the rural roads as well. So that bottom line there doesn't look like it's increased as much, but in terms of percentage terms, that's actually greater than the changes that we saw in some of the urban areas, and we've got a little bit more evidence on that now too. Now what's happened since then is the DFT have published their data, and for the first time they've actually exposed this at a much more granular level. So you can see those spikes there in April for all forms of transport. So in the examples that they have, you've got cars, motorcycles, light commercial vehicles, rigid heavy goods vehicles. So light commercial vehicles are those vans. You can see there was definitely that increase in speeding in that post-pandemic period, in the immediate weeks after lockdown. But then it has universally tailed off, and I think it's hard to tell just using the naked eye on this, but it seems like speeding levels or levels of non-compliance have more or less returned back to where they were before. And actually, if you have a look at the annual data, so you compare the 2019 to 2020 data, and we think about the different types of roads on there, you can see that there has been an increase of 1 mile per hour. This is only published as integers. We don't have decimal places on this. So yeah, we got a 1 mile an hour increase on motorways and a 1 mile an hour increase on national speed limits, but doesn't seem to have been any significant change on those urban roads. But actually, this is only based on around 80 different individual survey locations that the Department of Transport look at every single year. So we thought, what would happen if you looked at this information and you looked at some of that telematics data? So the evidence that I showed you from the Cardiff map there, gathered from vehicle sat navs and telematics devices, if you use that, could you look into a little bit more detail and see whether that evidence at a national level was backing up some of the DFT data? So here's the result of that analysis that we did. So we just looked at average speeds here, and then because we've got the national speed limit map as well included in this, we can see how those changes happened. So I think what this is doing is this is backing up what we've seen in some of those other charts. So the percentage changes in miles per hour aren't very large, but there have been some reductions in those urban areas. I think this is actually quite encouraging, because this is obviously where speed impact on VRUs can have the biggest change. So in 20s and 30s, it does seem that we've had a small reduction in vehicle speeds, average vehicle speeds of around 0.5 mile per hour. 40s and 50s, they tend to be more urban distributor roads, not changed as much. But yeah, on those rural roads and on the motorways, there has been that increase in vehicle speeds. So yeah, that's the information that we've got from this data. It doesn't quite align precisely, and of course there are lots of unlockdowns and lockdowns in the individual post data. So it's not perfect, but it does tend to back up a lot of the other evidence that we're seeing out there about where the change in road user behaviour is. I talked about applying this at a local level. You can do that. So this is an individual street scene using that same information. So wherever you've got the roads coloured in green, that shows where you've seen a reduction in vehicle speed versus the pre-pandemic period, and red is showing an increase in vehicle speeds. So, really useful if you want to explore what's actually been happening on individual local roads. Okay, just briefly run through some of the information here. So also within that DFT data, you can access information on average delay, and delay is slightly different to speed. And they've been measuring this for a number of years. You can go back about 10 years within the data. So have a look at the level of delay there. So on urban roads, we can see that there's been a larger reduction in delay. So, a reduction in congestion, which you would have thought would have automatically increased vehicle speeds, but some of the other data that we're saying that that hasn't always happened. So we've had a reduction in congestion, but we haven't always seen that increase in speeds. But on rural roads, it seems that there has been that opportunity, which is interesting. What is the relationship between people's speed choice, the speeds that they choose to travel at, versus the speeding, opportunity? So if you can't speed because it's congested roads, then you don't have the opportunity to increase your speeds. So that's rural roads versus urban roads. What you can do is you can also have a look at that at different times of day within the DFT data. So again, this is available as a historical series. And yeah, you can see there that it really is a big reduction in delays during those peak periods. So the green and the brown there are the AM and PM peaks. So we've seen a much more of a flattening out within the way that people are using the road network. So yeah, the daily commute times seem to have become much less busy, and that might be something that you've seen on your roads as well. But in those inter-peak periods and off-peak periods, not seen any significant changes in delays there. So perhaps vehicle traffic is flattening out a little bit more, and might that have an impact on road safety as well? So, yep, summing this up, speeds have reduced slightly in urban areas, but increased on those interurban and strategic routes that tend to be characterized by those higher speed limits, and the traffic profile is changing. So, yeah, that question that I posed, are people making changes in speed choice, or are they just making the most of an opportunity? And will any of these observed changes influence mode choice? If you think, that the roads are less busy and cars are traveling more slowly, are you more likely to want to choose an active travel mode, for example? And then, yeah, does less congestion provide opportunities for changing our streets at the same time? If we can show that there's less congestion, then surely there's a better argument there for freeing up more space for active travel. Not always going to be popular with the Jeremy Clarksons of this world, though. So finally, then onto road casualties. Just going to talk a little bit about the data that's been published by the DFT that was towards the end of September. So those of you who know me know that, I live and breathe Stats 19 data. We're processing the individual record data through to Mast Online at the moment, which I know many of you use, and that enables us to look at this in more detail. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have time before this webinar to go through all of that information, so I'm going to be relying on the DFT data there, but I think, they've done a really good job this year at trying to give us within the profession a bit more insight into what actually happened last year. So I'm just going to be having a look at the 2020 data there. And you can access all of this through the links that I've got there. So in terms of the percentage changes in traffic, and then relating that to the casualties on the road, so you can see the motor traffic line is the light green line on the chart there. So you can see that big dip in traffic in April, May, June, and then going back up in the inter-lockdown period, and then a small drop again in November. And if you align, so the slight casualties in there, they seem to align pretty well. The serious casualties, very strong correlation there, but there wasn't as big a dip in the number of people killed on the roads as you would expect. And this was the question that I was posing. Have our roads got safer based on the amount of traffic reduction? It would seem from this, just looking at those lines, that it hasn't. And actually, this is something that a lot of other countries in Europe and across the world have reported as well, that there wasn't the commensurate drop in fatalities that we'd have expected to see. Think about why that may have happened. and some of the evidence that we saw on speeding. Is that one of the links? Did we not see as big a drop in fatalities because we had that very strange spike in the number of people that chose to exceed the speed limit? If you then break this down by individual road user groups, you can see that you've got the largest drops there in the number of pedestrians. Then we've got car occupants. Motorcyclists didn't see as big a drop. I've not thought about this one in too much detail. We saw the traffic levels drop similarly, so why didn't the casualty numbers drop as much? But then with pedal cyclists, yes, that drop wasn't as much, but we did see a lot more people out cycling. So again, you've got to think about this in terms of rates. And fortunately for us, the DFT have considered this and published some evidence on it, which you'll see in a slide or two. The next one is to have a look at male and female. Now, I think this one is particularly fascinating, and there's all sorts of societal reasons why this may have happened, or it could be due to who's considered as a key worker. Are more males key workers, so they're more likely to be out during those lockdown periods? Or is this just reflecting what actually happened in the schools? Was it that more women ended up staying at home and doing the homeschooling while the men went out to work? I have no evidence to suggest this. I think it is fascinating, though, that the most at-risk sex, which is men, and I think we all know that, and it's pretty well agreed and understood, we're seeing more men on the roads. So if we're going to keep having more men on the roads, is that a bad thing, given that women generally are less likely to be involved as casualties on the roads? I won't dwell on that one too much, but it is a very interesting trend that we saw there, and has that continued into 2021. Then you can have a look at ages. So yeah, you can see the biggest drops there in the child casualties during those lockdown periods. They were at home, and there's possibly the case as well for some of the older casualties who may have been isolating. So yeah, you can see that the types of people that were injured on the roads were, more likely to be adults rather than in those younger or older age categories. Now, this is the chart that I was talking about in terms of rates, and it's something that I'm really keen that we as a profession understand. So the individual changes in numbers are interesting and are important and give you a clue as to what's going on, but you need to understand that rate relative to traffic. So you can see that for seriously injured rates, top right hand corner, all casualty rates, slightly injured rates, we did see a drop. So a continuation in trend of road safety improving in these areas. But the fatality rates, top left hand corner, this is representing the fact that we didn't see as big a drop in the number of people killed on our road as we would expect based on the traffic. So we've had a long-term trend of roads getting less dangerous in terms of fatal casualties. But yeah, last year we saw that increase. And as I said, this has happened around the world as well. But if you examine pedal cycles in a little bit more detail, you can see that wasn't seen for pedal cycles. So even if you look at the killed, the serious, and the slight rate there, all of them dropped in that last year period, 2020. So cycling got safer. I know we tragically saw an increase in the number of cyclists who were killed on the road, but that was to some extent offset by the increase in cycling that we saw. Is this representing safety in numbers, which is a phenomenon that many people will be aware of, or is this just saying that cycling is safer when there are fewer cars on the roads? It could just be as simple as that. And what does this tell us about creating, a safe system for active travel? We don't have a lot of data on e-scooters, but this is the information that the DFT have published. And unsurprisingly, before the hire schemes, almost nobody was reported as being injured on those e-scooters, but it has absolutely leapt up. You can see the drop in November there when we did have that lockdown. What's this going to be looking like into 2021? And what do we need to do to understand the relative danger of this group? Because it's a new group, they're very visible, we are concerned about it. But actually, is pedestrian safety much more important? How are these e-scooter riders being involved in collisions? The PACT report that was released just a couple of days ago seemed to indicate that they're mainly single vehicle collisions, i.e. it's somebody falling off the e-scooter. They're not involved with another vehicle at a time. So yeah, just a few more questions here, as I've used up more than my 20 minutes already. So is the 2020 data useful? Do we just ignore it? Do we just say, well, that was an artifact, that was a very unusual set of circumstances, and that doesn't represent what's happened now? But does it give us some insight? Does it? Can we find out more about vehicle and VIU crashes that happened during those periods? So if we're aiming, COP26 is on at the moment, we want to reduce the number of vehicles that are on the roads, and we want to increase the number of people that are cycling and walking. 2020 is an example of what that might look like. Does this provide a model for what the future could be? And can we think a bit more about how we protect those users? Has the type of VIU casualty changed? Did we suddenly see a lot of people who weren't used to being cyclists going on the road? That's something that's been mentioned to me, that a number of those that were killed and seriously injured were inexperienced cyclists. What a role can we play as a profession in making sure that anybody that wants to become a cyclist can do so safely? And is it possible to see reliable local patterns within the data that you hold, or within the data that other companies might be willing to sell to you, for example? So what's happening now? Are we back to normal? And I'm looking forward to your comments on this one. Are we really back to normal? Are things subtly different? Are things significantly different? And what data, because I care about the data a lot, what data can we use to predict risks on those local roads? Okay, so I will stop sharing that and have a look within the chat, and hopefully Ed can help me out here and see whether there's any questions that have been coming in.
We do have a question we can kick off with, actually, and thanks for that, Richard. That was a very interesting presentation. The question is from Neil Gregg, who says, any thoughts on the impact that the lack of driving tests, i.e. fewer new drivers getting on the road, could have had on collision stats?
Thanks, Neil. Whoa, that's a good one, isn't it? Well, we know from the last economic blip, so the banking crisis led to at the same kind of time a reduction in the number of young people going out and getting licenses. And we do know that those that are 17 and 18-year-olds especially are the ones that are most at risk, which is why most road safety professionals would call for some form of graduated licensing to make sure that they are much more strictly controlled in the months and years after they've passed their tests. So it stands to reason, surely, that if we've seen a lower number of very young car drivers hitting the roads, that you would expect to see a significant reduction there. That's something that I think we're going to be looking at in much more detail. DFT have published some of it out there, but yeah, we'd definitely be digging a little bit more deeply into that to try and understand what has been happening with young drivers.
We've got a second question which actually follows on a similar line from Alan Dowling. It says, with fewer driving tests, has there been an increase of people without driving without passing their test?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what you'd need to look at there is offence data. Now, I know that the Home Office do publish fixed penalty data. I don't think it's a fixed penalty, though. Somebody might know better than I do. I'm pretty sure it's not a fixed penalty for driving without a license. It might be something else. So we'd have to have a look at that prosecution data. I would have thought that may be out already for 2020. So that might be something that's worth looking at. I've not actually looked at that specific offence code in the past. I think there were definitely some unusual behaviours that may have taken place, and that could well have been related to a perceived lack of enforcement. And actually, there was a really good study that came out in Australia around this. They very quickly publicised that they weren't going to be doing any more speed enforcement or drink driving enforcement, and in that lockdown period, everybody's at home. A lot of people might be drinking a little bit more than normal as well. They saw a huge increase in the number of drink drive related accidents. And I do know that in the UK that certain types of speed enforcement were reduced differently according to the force during that initial lockdown period. And I'm pretty sure that that didn't happen later on as well. So was it a bit of a wild west? Were people out there doing crazy things? Were they speeding? Were they drink driving? I think it's definitely worthy of some further investigation.
Right, have we got any more questions? Anyone willing? Oh, we have another two have just come in very quickly, but in the meantime, is anyone willing to raise their hand and join the debate? But I'll just take the first of these two questions that have just come in. If you bear with me 1 sec, we'll open the window up. The first says, I think early e-scooter rental scheme in Australia showed us as much as 50% of riders would have walked. Is the reduction in car use due to scooters worth the loss of walking, and which is better for the climate?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I hinted at that a little bit in there. I don't think there's enough information, certainly within the UK, about these schemes and the types of people that use it and what kind of mode they're transferring from. So I think one thing that we did see in the pre-pandemic was a really big push towards bike rental schemes. I'd be very interested in seeing the level of bike rental scheme patronage against scooter scheme patronage, and there must be case studies across the UK within individual towns that had one and then had the other. And if we saw people just move from the bikes to the scooters, then I don't think that will have seen an increase in people shifting away from cars. Similarly, if it's just people who would have walked anyway, then that wouldn't be so good. I suspect, although I don't have the evidence, that there's been very, very few people who will have moved from a car commute to an e-scooter commute. But it's definitely something that we need to learn a lot more about before we promote those kind of schemes more widely.
And another question for you, this one's from Liz Brooker. And don't worry, Liz, it does make sense. Do you think we should be worried about the potential risk to young road users travelling to school? Will there be an issue as they've had no or very little experience of travelling alone in the run-up to them leaving primary school?
So, yeah, I think the hint there is if they haven't had experience in towards the end of primary school, where they'd normally be subjected to education campaigns, training, if they're now going to be let loose on roads that are perhaps busier as well, maybe even faster, although hopefully not, looking at some of the data, are they going to be more at risk? I think it's hard to say that they absolutely would be, because you'd need to quantify the reduction in the level of training and the impact that original training had. I think I would be worried about people who were new to cycling, for example, who are used to quieter roads, perhaps, who perhaps when the level of car traffic increased may not be as well equipped to dealing with that. But yeah, we should be making sure that the education and training schemes that are delivered in primary schools continue, or at least restart as much as possible.
And we have one more from Barry McMillan at the moment. It says, with the rise in staycations, has there been a change in the location of incidents?
Oh, that's fascinating. How much can I say on this? We're just starting a report for a popular tourist area in England, let me say that. And it's looking at comparing what happened in the pre and post-pandemic period in terms of casualties, and to look and see whether that may have been everybody going on holiday in a staycation to that particular popular peninsular type area. So I think there are people who live and work in these popular tourist areas that are starting to think, if I'm going to be seeing more traffic on my roads, and people who certainly aren't used to traveling on my roads, has there been that increase? I think staycations are here to stay. I don't see that we're going to have a lot of people traveling abroad in 2022. So I think, if you live, work, represent an area that does benefit from a lot of tourism, then thinking about what kind of campaigns and messages there are for next summer, I think is going to be really crucial.
Thanks. At the moment, we don't have any more questions. Oh, we have a raised hand, do we? Here we are, Nick. Nick Rawlings. Let's promote you to panelist and later talk. Just bear with the technology to do its thing very quickly. Hello, Nick, are you there?
Hello.
Helen. Hi, Nick. We can hear you now.
Hi,
How are you?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like a seance.
Richard, I just had to ring. I just had to call in and say I love your shirt.
Thanks very much.
That's not the only question I want to ask, actually, but there you go. You asked a question earlier on that I'm not sure you've answered, maybe deliberately, but if I could just ask you to reflect on it again, if you wouldn't mind. You asked a question, something like along the lines of, has the pandemic had an impact on the road safety role and led to a more integrated approach to traffic management? What's your view on that?
So like you, like many of us, we speak to people in neighbouring authorities, we speak to people around the country. I think money helps. There has been an enormous amount of money that is coming into active travel. A lot of that has been focused on engineering, but some of that is related to making people want to cycle and walk and e-scooter and not horse ride, but these are the forms of transport more. And I think that is an area where we as road safety professionals, with our experience in behavior change, in trying to encourage safer behavior, can really be playing a part. How well integrated it is, I'm not entirely sure. So I do know some really good specific examples of people who are very much pivoting in towards active travel, creating active travel portals, linking that to safe routes to school. People are using the evidence around where there's high levels of speeding and high levels of traffic outside schools and saying, look, you can't be promoting active travel in these areas without some form of intervention. So I think using the evidence that we have in road safety about collisions, about risk, and then bringing that into active travel and saying, no, we need to have safe and active travel. I think there are some good examples around that. So I've seen some good examples in Birmingham, West Berkshire, of course. There's a number of different areas, but they're absolutely joint goals, and I don't think we should ever separate them out.
Thank you very much. It's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Right, we've got one more question in the chat, which we'll take before I think we'll draw the session to a close, as it's already 11:15. The question from Kendrick Horde reads, do we think the increase in deliveries has also gone back down to pre-COVID levels? Presumably the goods vehicle traffic levels would follow this.
Yeah, so just looking at the September data from DFT would suggest that they haven't gone back down, and I don't think they're likely to go back down as well. Now, HGV drivers are a different matter because we haven't got enough of them apparently, but the traffic still appears to be up there. But I think the van driver, the local deliveries are definitely there. And if you're responsible for safety and transport within an urban area, then I suspect you would be concerned about the increase in van traffic that's happening on the roads. And are there other schemes that could be promoted in a local area that would encourage more sustainable delivery mechanisms? And I know that does happen within some boroughs of London, for example. I think the increase in delivery vehicles was coming anyway. It has seen a step change, and I'm pretty sure that it's here to stay. So we definitely need to be thinking about what kind of messages that we're putting out there. Are we talking to the courier companies, making sure that their drivers are getting the appropriate training? Do they have the systems on board to make sure that they can detect cyclists, for example? There's a lot more work I think that needs to be done within the courier fleets to make sure that their safety record is at least as good as car drivers. And if you look at some of the data, it appears that it's not.
Excellent. Well, as I said, I think we'll draw the session to a close there. Amazingly, we've still got just about everybody online. We've had a few people drop off over the 50 minutes, predominantly during the Q&A session. So I wonder if that's because my face has been on the screen as well. But you never know.
No, it's great working together, Ed.
Yes, it went really well. First of all, I'll say thanks to everybody for attending, and particularly to those people who have just posed a question. It's made for an interesting Q&A session to follow what was a very interesting presentation. So a big thank you to Richard also for your time. I think you've given us permission. It's okay to record this session, and we'll make that available on the festival website, which I'm sure by now you'll all know where to find. I'll look to edit that today and get it online this afternoon for you all, if you do want to catch up on anything that has been said.
Hope to see you all in person next year, 2022. Harrogate, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
We'll keep our fingers crossed. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And if you've got any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to drop me an email as well. So thanks, everybody, and see you soon.